Thank you, Chair Jenkins and members of the committee. I encourage you to listen carefully to the testimony that we'll hear today on both sides of this issue. I have been working in the area of housing access and affordability for many, many years, and come at this with multiple different perspectives. I represent a district that has really seen an acute housing crisis, but I know I'm not alone in that all of your districts are experiencing this. Why I bring this bill forward today is because I've heard from more and more working people about the challenges that they have in accessing housing. Housing policy can be complicated, and it requires the participation of multiple stakeholders in the community, and local, state, and federal government policies really influence market factors around housing. What we know about the housing crisis that is striking communities across Washington state is that there are different drivers in different communities. In the community that I represent, rapid population growth and a mismatch between housing supply and housing demand is driving intense cost increases. And in rural areas around our state, we know that lack of access to jobs is preventing people from having adequate income to meet the rents in their communities. I also come at this work as both an affordable housing developer and an operator of subsidized housing with about 1,200 tenants in the Seattle area. So I understand the challenges that landlords face in terms of meeting their costs, having a reasonable return on their investment. I think local communities are best situated to bring together the appropriate stakeholders to figure out the right policies for their local communities. And that is why I think it is time to repeal the preemption on locally imposed rent regulations. I'm glad to take any questions.
Are there questions for Representative Macri? Thank you, Representative Macri. We're going to move into our public testimony, and I'm just going to warn people right now that there are 59 people who have signed in to testify. You will not all be able to testify. We're going to hear this bill for 30 minutes. I will go pro and con with 3 people per panel, and we'll try and get as many people in as possible. You are certainly welcome to submit your written testimony to the committee at any time. With that, I'm going to call Xochitl Makovich, sorry, Xochitl, Edmund Witter, and Mia Franklin. And on deck will be Bob Mitchell, Mike Ennis is signed in twice. Bob Mitchell, Mike Ennis, and Roger Valdez. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Mia Franklin. I reside in Federal Way, and I'm a proud member of Washington Can. I have 3 adult children, one which has a developmental disability, and I've been her care provider for the past 30 years. Being a tenant, a taxpayer, and a community advocate in many forms on behalf of all people, I know firsthand how oppressing these systems can be. So I'm here today to speak on the housing crisis that is crippling our communities and creating a direct impact on low-income families, single-parent families, people of color, our disability community, our vulnerable citizens, seniors, and immigrants. 6 months ago, I had to move in with my daughter with a disability because my rent was increased by $200 when I renewed my lease. I went from paying $1,500 a month faithfully to $1,700 per month almost overnight. When you add the high cost of utilities, especially in the wintertime, to this expense, your landlord, knowingly or unknowingly, has just set the stage to create a homeless environment for individuals like myself and families. When a landlord raises your rent, it does not mean that your job or Social Security or DSHS or wherever your income comes from automatically increases to cover that added expense. Back in the day, your rent may have increased $25 to $50 a year, giving families an opportunity to make adjustments in their budgets. But how do you adjust $200, $300, and even $400 a month with a 30-day notice? It's not realistic, and it sure as hell doesn't feel like the American dream. It feels like an American nightmare. Rent is high, and for most, wages are low. Are we the people supposed to continue to live in fear, paycheck to paycheck, wondering when homelessness will knock on our door? It is the job of legislators to hear the cries of the people and respond responsibly. Otherwise, you can look around and know that your decisions are also contributing to the homeless issues we have statewide. Statewide. So I want to thank Legislator McCree for bringing this issue forward, and I'm asking you, the representatives, to please hold landlords accountable by lifting the ban off of rent regulation. We need the legislator to pass Senate Bill 6400, 2583, and 2448 so that cities have the freedom to address the housing crisis and create.
Thank you.
Thank you. Empower to all people.
Okay.
Go ahead.
My name is Sochi Makovich, and I'm the political director for Washington Community Action Network, which has 44,000 members throughout the state. We urge the committee to pass House Bill 2583. The ban on rent regulation creates a chilling effect on municipalities, preventing many from pursuing innovative solutions to solve our housing crisis. For example, in late 2016, the city of Seattle passed legislation to require payment plans of upfront costs so that tenants could access housing. Before the law was passed, landlords were asked for last month's security deposit, non-refundable fees all up front, which could easily be $5,000 or $6,000. This modest legislation helped homeless people get into housing, but a landlord lobbying association is suing the city over it, claiming that it violates the ban on rent regulation. Before that lawsuit, there were smaller cities who were interested in exploring similar legislation, but will now have to wait until it is resolved. And so now there are thousands of more people in the state who have to wait to get housing. This is just one example of many. Repealing the statute gives cities the freedom to implement a wide range of policies to address our housing crisis. Even though the legislation does not create any sort of policy, opponents of this legislation have been using alarmist rhetoric about a specific form of rent regulation that doesn't exist anywhere in the country. There's no policy in any state that creates a permanent rent ceiling. The U.S. Supreme Court requires rent regulation policies to allow landlords to earn a reasonable profit on their properties. You will hear them talk about a variety of studies on the issue, but they will fail to mention there are studies in support of rent regulation, such as a 400-page study in 2009 done by Cal State of LA that showed rent regulation had no impact on the development of new housing, and that the private market alone, and I'm quoting here, the private market alone will not produce housing within the reach of majority of renters. Opponents will talk about a study done last year about San Francisco, but they will probably fail to mention that the study supports government intervention into the housing market. As on many issues, there are conflicting studies, but we aren't here to debate any specific forms of rent regulation. We are here to get rid of the ban so we can have a robust discussion on the local level about a wide range of policy options to house the over 9,300 people sleeping outside tonight in our state. The housing crisis burdens cities and counties far more than the state. For example, the city of Seattle spent almost $17 million more.
Can you please wrap up?
So there's 35,000 homeless kids. The housing crisis is getting worse for so many more people. Repeal this ban so that we can pass real solutions on the local level.
Thank you. Go ahead.
My name is Edmund Witter. I'm the director of the Housing Justice Project in King County. I'm a housing attorney, and I've worked in jurisdictions that have rent regulations and those that do not have rent regulations. And I can speak from experience about what its ill effects are and what its positive effects are. The question before this committee today is very simple. Do we want to have this discussion at the local level about rent regulation? This bill does not create any kind of rent regulatory system at all, and it could very well be that there is none. Because right now, for example, with commercial leases, there is no prohibition on rent regulation, yet there is none in the state. It doesn't mean that any local jurisdiction is going to implement anything, and it could be just a ability to give that local jurisdiction to work on this problem and make sure that they have all options available. As Ms. Makovich said, that the city of Seattle, for example, spends roughly about $17 million more than the state to deal with homelessness issues. And there's a lot of things that we do agree about, which is that King County has the third largest homeless population in the country, It has 47% of its homeless live without any kind of shelter. We know that a $100 rent increase is correlated with the rise in homelessness between 6 to 32%. And we know that in 2017, Washington's median rent increased by 17%, while its state median income only increased by 3%. There is an affordability crisis that is going on right now, and we need to give our local jurisdictions the ability to work on these problems and come up with solutions. As Ms. Makovich said, that there are studies on both sides of this issue, but the question for this committee is not to decide whether rent regulation is a good or bad thing or is the solution to our problems. It's to give our local municipalities and our counties the ability to think through these problems and have this debate openly. As the Washington Supreme Court said in Hilsinger-Gilman, the Constitution and general law recognize that large, growing cities should be empowered to determine for themselves and in their own way the many important and complex questions of local policy which may arise. I ask that the committee do that today.
Questions? Thank you. Oh, Representative Clipper.
Sir, just very quickly, if there is rent regulation in the local community, leaders say that it can only go to a certain amount. Do you think that that might even exacerbate the housing problem that we have today because more builders won't want to build because they'll see there's no profit in building those types of houses?
So there was a study in 1970s, a study in New Jersey. In New Jersey, some municipalities have rent regulations, some of them didn't. And it's found that in the 1970s, for example, those municipalities that had rent regulations saw a decrease in building about 52%, but those who had no rent regulations saw a decrease in building of 88%. In New York City, the biggest boom was in the 1920s and between 1945 and 1965. That's when the largest buildings were happening in New York City. That was also a time when they had severe rent control, which they don't even have right now, which was actually setting more ceilings and was much more harsher on property owners. There's not really a strong correlation. There's studies, I think, that go on both sides. But the point is, we need to have, it could be just a simple solution of no increases above 15% in a year for a current tenant. It could be that simple. It doesn't have to be really complex, because I think even if we see a market that's seeing increases of 15%, most people raise their eyebrows at that.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. Moving on to the next panel, which is Bob Mitchell, Mike Ennis, and Roger Valdez. And on deck will be Thomas Fugelstad, Gina Owen, and Joselito Lopez. Go ahead.
Good morning, Chairman Jenkins, committee members. My name.
Go ahead, ma'am, and start.
Oh. Sorry. My name is Gina Owens, and I am a 16-year member of Washington Community Action Network. Several years ago, I was in a car accident that rendered me disabled and unable to work any longer. I was unable to keep up with the steep cost of rent and was soon evicted from the fair market value rental I was in, even though I was paying as much as possible towards my rent every month. I became homeless and lived in shelters and transitional housing. I was subjected to the homeless shelters and transitional housing for about 2 to 3 years. After this period, I finally assessed housing through Seattle Housing Authority's public housing programs, and I never looked back after that. Having lived these experiences helped me see firsthand how difficult just one circumstance can be in your life. I know that most people in a similar situation to me will not be able to assess any sort of public resources because the wait lists for them all have grown so much. People have to wait in lines for as much as years and decades. We need to pass House Bill 2583 so cities can develop policies to get people housed and help them keep their housing once they're there. In this time era, we are all living on the edge with incomes that are stagnated versus living expenses that are skyrocketing to astronomical amounts. Rental housing is no doubt the most expensive of those costs, especially in the last decade. I understand that landlords and developers need to make a living. I understand they need to cover expenses for owning those units. But I don't understand why they feel renters should pay such high costs to support their personal needs. They already knew when they became landlords what would be expected of them in keeping up with the units and tenants in their buildings. I don't agree that
Can you please wrap up
Yes,
one
I
last
am.
sentence, ma'am?
I don't agree that I, as a renter, and the millions of renters like me, should be subjected to paying increased costs every time they need to protect their profit margin. The cost to renters should only be to afford them the income needed to support their units, not for their personal living costs too. Thank you.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay. Well, hello, esteemed legislators. My name is Joselito Lopez, and I currently live in Mount Vernon, close to Anacortes. I am a member of Washington Can, and I am here today to support HB 2583. In 2008, I lived in an apartment in Montlake Terrace called Andorra with my mother and my stepfather. In 2008, when we moved in, we only paid $800 in rent. In 2013, our rent was $1,300. That's a $500 increase. Because of the rent increase, my stepfather, my mother, and I had to move to Mount Vernon because we could not afford to live there anymore. I had 2 heart attacks and a double bypass surgery. I was unable to work for 2 years, and I just recently got back into the market again, the job market in 2008. And so we were doing our best, always paying our rent on time, and it just kept on going up and up. Toilet was always overflowing. Nothing worked. Constantly went to the office to ask them why the rent was going up and nothing was working, and they would never give us an answer. This housing crisis is causing a huge stressor on my family and a lot of other families. Both my parents had several health issues, and so that made things worse. I was working as a Microsoft contractor and still not making enough. Let's see here. So living far away from the big employers severely impacts my ability to get another job, pays decently. I mean, unless I want to go into farm work, but that's not necessarily what I want to do. So we need to repeal the ban on rent regulation so that cities and counties can address the housing crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead. Why don't we have you, can staff bring a chair around so that she can have access to the mic? Sure. There. How about that? Will that work? Sure. That works, yeah. Okay, and I'll add some time to the timer so that you can have time to translate. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And again, my name is Tommy Ferglet. I'm from Seattle, and I'm with the union, FSE. I support the removal of the ban for rent, for the rent control. The reason I'm supporting the ban is because the price of housing in Seattle has skyrocketed. And because of that, it's impacting a lot of state workers. Because the state workers, their cost of living is not equal to the wage that they're earning. I've been going to many meetings, and I've been hearing many people complain about the different costs of living.
and about the fact that the rents have been skyrocketing for quite a long time, and it's making it difficult for them to be able to survive. Many of them have had to move around constantly out of the city limits, and it makes it difficult for them to be able to get from work to home and vice versa. And many of the state workers actually don't earn that much money. Many people think that because they're state workers, they earn quite a bit, but often they don't, and the cost and the price of living is going up and up and up. It's making it very difficult for many of them to live. And it's more than just in Seattle. And oftentimes many of them are forced to work more than one job to be able to make ends meet. Thank you.